The bullet snapped past Jordan Hale's ear close enough to feel the heat displacement, and in that fraction of a second, she made a decision that would either get her killed or save every man on SEAL Team 7. The night had erupted into chaos around her, muzzle flashes strobing from the ridgelines like deadly fireflies, RPG trails scratching orange lines across the black Afghan sky, tracers chewing through the sand and stone with the hungry sound of lead meeting earth. Chief Derek Maddox was screaming into his radio, his voice cracking with an emotion Jordan had never heard from him before. Fall back. Fall back. But Jordan wasn't falling back. She was rising to her feet while everyone else scrambled for cover, and she was walking forward into the teeth of the ambush because she understood something the rest of the team hadn't grasped yet. The retreat route was mined. She'd seen the buried pressure plates glinting under the thin layer of dust, positioned exactly where panicked men would run when the bullets started flying. Whoever had planned this ambush hadn't just prepared a kill zone. They'd prepared a grave. But we need to go back further to understand why Jordan Hale was the only person who saw what was really happening that night. We need to understand the woman who walked forward when every instinct, every training scenario, every voice on the radio was screaming at her to run. Jordan grew up on the outskirts of El Paso in a small house where the desert wind rattled the windows and the nearest neighbors were 3 miles away. Her father, Marcus Hale, had been a Marine raider before a Taliban bullet in Kandahar ended his operational career and sent him home with a titanium plate in his skull and a daughter to raise alone. Jordan's mother had left when Jordan was 4, a woman who couldn't handle military life and didn't want to try. Marcus never spoke badly about her. He simply focused on raising his daughter with the same intensity he'd brought to every mission in his 20-year career. By the time Jordan was 8, she could field strip an M16 blindfolded. By 12, she was shooting competitively, winning regional championships against adults twice her age. By 16, she understood tactics well enough to identify the flaws in her father's old mission briefings when he used them as teaching tools. But more important than any skill was the philosophy Marcus drilled into her before she could even shoot straight. 3 rules that became the foundation of everything she would become. Never turn your back on the fight. Never leave anyone behind. And never let fear make the decision for you. Those rules defined Jordan's path to naval special warfare, a journey that required her to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy. She excelled at every physical test, every tactical evaluation, every psychological assessment. Her shot groupings were tighter than operators with years more experience. Her endurance scores broke records that had stood for a decade. Her tactical awareness in simulated combat scenarios earned reluctant praise from instructors who had bet against her making it through the first week. None of it mattered to the men who had already decided she didn't belong. When command reassigned her to SEAL Team 7 for a hostage recovery operation in the Helmand Ridge, the temperature in the briefing room dropped 20 degrees. Chief Derek Maddox, the team leader with a beard like steel wool and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed in disapproval, looked her up and down like she was a malfunctioning weapon he'd been forced to accept. "This op is hostile terrain," he said, his voice carrying the weight of judgment already rendered. "This isn't a PR stunt. Stay where I tell you. Don't improvise." Jordan nodded and said nothing. She'd learned long ago that arguing with men who had already decided you didn't belong was just wasting oxygen that could be better used staying alive. Now pay attention to what happens next, because this is where everything changes. The mission parameters were straightforward. A CIA engineer named David Chun had been kidnapped by a splinter cell operating from a compound in a dried-out riverbed. Chun had information about satellite systems that could compromise national security if extracted through interrogation. The team would infiltrate under moonlight, neutralize resistance, recover the hostage, and extract via helicopter from a designated landing zone 3 kilometers north. Standard hostage recovery. Except nothing about this operation felt standard to Jordan from the moment they inserted. The team moved silently across rocky terrain, 8 operators spread in tactical formation with Jordan deliberately placed in the middle where she couldn't lead or make decisions. Maddox had made her position clear. Follow. Don't think. Let the real SEALs handle the work. 50 meters from the compound, Jordan's instincts began screaming. The silence was wrong. Not the natural quiet of a sleeping enemy camp, but the deliberate stillness of men waiting in ambush. She noticed a glint of metal in the sand that shouldn't have been there. A shadow on the ridgeline that moved against the wind instead of with it. And then she saw the tripwires. Fresh ones. Crisscrossed deliberately across their approach vector, positioned to funnel them into a specific corridor. She keyed her calm, keeping her voice low and controlled. Tripviri, 11 o'clock. We're walking into a choke point. Maddox's response was immediate and dismissive. Stay quiet, Hale. We're moving. Follow orders. Jordan hesitated, that instinct her father had drilled into her tightening like a knot in her chest. Something was wrong. Everything about this approach was wrong. But she was the outsider, the woman who somehow passed, the operator whose judgment meant nothing to men who had spent years building a brotherhood that excluded her by definition. She could push back and be ignored, or she could follow and hope she was wrong. She wasn't wrong. The ambush erupted with professional precision. Muzzle flashes from elevated positions on both ridgelines, interlocking fields of fire that turned the approach corridor into a meat grinder. RPGs streaked from concealed positions, their trails painting deadly arcs across the night sky. The SEALs dove for cover as bullets chewed through the sand around them, their tactical formation shattering into individual survival instincts. Maddox was screaming into his radio, his voice raw with an emotion that sounded terrifyingly like panic. Fall back. Fall back. But falling back meant death. Jordan could see what no one else had noticed yet. The exit route they'd used to approach was now lined with buried pressure plates, hastily concealed under thin layers of dust. The enemy had predicted exactly how American special operators would respond to an ambush. They would retreat along their infiltration route, maintaining tactical discipline, falling back to a defensible position, and they would step on mines that would tear them apart before they made it 50 meters. She keyed her comm and shouted over the gunfire. The back route is mined. You'll blow the entire team if you retreat. Chaos swallowed her warning. The men were already crawling backward, fear overriding training, survival instinct drowning out the voice of the woman they'd never trusted anyway. Jordan watched them moving toward death, watched the team she'd been assigned to protect crawling into a kill zone they couldn't see, and she understood something in that moment with crystalline clarity. No one was coming to save them. If she didn't act, they all died. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, steady and certain. Never turn your back on the fight. Never leave anyone behind. Never let fear make the decision for you. Jordan took a breath, steadied her rifle, and instead of crawling backward like everyone else, she rose to her feet. Remember this moment. Remember what it looks like when someone chooses courage over survival. The bullets that had been chewing through the sand seemed to pause for a fraction of a second, as if the universe itself was surprised by her audacity. Then they resumed, snapping past her head, kicking up dirt at her feet, filling the air with the deadly whisper of high-velocity lead. Jordan walked forward, not running, not charging, but walking with the deliberate pace of someone who was reading the battlefield like a book written in muzzle flashes and tracer paths. She wasn't being reckless. She was being tactical. The ambush had been designed to trap men who behaved predictably. Jordan was behaving in a way no one had predicted. She identified the threats with the speed of someone who had spent years training for exactly this scenario. The primary gunner on the eastern ridge, controlling the heaviest suppressive fire. The spotter beside him, directing the engagement. 2 guards on the western flank, managing the crossfire that kept the team pinned. And 1 operator with a radio, coordinating with what had to be a quick reaction force waiting to finish off survivors. The radio operator was the key. Take him out and the reinforcements would be blind. Jordan raised her rifle, controlled her breathing the way her father had taught her on those long mornings in the El Paso desert, and squeezed the trigger. The radio operator dropped. She transitioned to the spotter, fired, transitioned to the left flank rifleman, fired. 3 shots in under 4 seconds. The ridge fell quiet. The remaining fighters panicked exactly as Jordan had predicted. Their coordinated ambush had relied on overwhelming firepower and psychological shock. When both elements failed, when the target they expected to be pinned and terrified was instead advancing and eliminating their key personnel, the discipline that held them together cracked. Jordan surged forward, sliding behind a boulder that gave her a flanking angle on the eastern position. 2 more shots eliminated the primary gunner and his backup. She moved again, using the terrain like a weapon, appearing from angles the remaining fighters hadn't covered because they'd never expected anyone to be insane enough to advance into their fire. In less than a minute, the firefight was over. The ridgelines were silent. The ambush that should have killed 8 SEALs had been dismantled by 1 operator walking forward while everyone else fell back. Jordan turned back toward her team. They were frozen in their retreat positions, staring at her like she was a ghost or a hallucination or something their minds couldn't quite process. She walked back to them through the silence she'd created, her rifle still raised, her eyes scanning for threats that no longer existed. Maddox was the first to find his voice. "You disobeyed a direct order," he said, and his voice was shaking in a way that had nothing to do with anger. Jordan holstered her rifle, her eyes hard and steady. "No, Chief. I stopped us from walking into a minefield." The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire had been. One by one, the SEALs looked at the retreat route they'd been crawling toward. One by one, they saw the subtle disturbances in the sand that marked buried explosives. One by one, they understood that the woman they'd dismissed, excluded, and underestimated had just saved their lives by doing the one thing none of them had the courage to do. What happens next is important. Pay attention. The mission wasn't over. David Chun was still in that compound, still waiting for rescue. Jordan looked at Maddox, and something had changed in the dynamic between them. The dismissal was gone from his eyes, replaced by something that might have been respect or might have been the simple recognition that his judgment had been catastrophically wrong. "We still have a hostage to recover," Jordan said. "I'll take point." Maddox nodded, not because protocol demanded it, but because he finally understood that Jordan Hale wasn't the weak link on this team. She was the strongest operator he'd ever served with, and he'd almost gotten them all killed by refusing to see it. The compound assault was textbook after that. Jordan led the breach, eliminating 2 guards with precise shots before they could raise their weapons. The team flowed behind her, their movements finally synchronized with someone who knew how to read a battlefield. They found Chun in a basement room, bound but unharmed, his eyes wide with disbelief when the operators cut his restraints. The extraction went smoothly, the helicopter arriving exactly on schedule to lift them out of the Helmand Ridge before enemy reinforcements could respond. This is the part of the story that changes everything. Back at base, the after-action report was filed with a single line that would define Jordan Hale's career. Primary engagement neutralized by Petty Officer Hale. Decision critical to team survival. But the words on paper didn't capture what had really changed. For the first time since she'd joined Naval Special Warfare, the men of SEAL Team 7 stopped calling her the girl. They stopped treating her like a political assignment or a diversity checkbox. They started calling her what she had always been. A SEAL. A warrior. A leader. The woman who walked forward when everyone else fell back. Maddox requested her permanent assignment to Team 7 the following week. Not because command told him to, but because he finally understood what Jordan's father had known since she was 8 years old. Some people are born with something that can't be trained or manufactured. The ability to see clearly when chaos blinds everyone else. The courage to move forward when fear screams retreat. The quiet certainty that comes from knowing exactly who you are, regardless of what others believe about you. And here's what you need to take from this story. Jordan Hale didn't walk into that ambush to prove anything to the men who doubted her. She walked forward because it was the right thing to do, because her team was going to die if she didn't, because her father had raised her to never turn her back on the fight and never leave anyone behind. The respect she earned that night wasn't her goal. It was a side effect of being exactly who she'd always been in a moment, when being anything less would have meant 8 flag-draped coffins and families who would never understand why their sons and husbands didn't come home. That's the lesson buried in this story. The lesson about courage and competence and the quiet strength that doesn't need validation from others to know its own worth. Jordan Hale was a SEAL long before anyone on Team 7 acknowledged it. She was a warrior long before that ambush in the Helmand Ridge. The only thing that changed that night was their perception. Her reality had been constant all along. Sometimes the people who doubt you the most become the ones who respect you the deepest. Sometimes the obstacles placed in your path become the platforms that elevate you above everyone who tried to hold you down. And sometimes, when everyone else is falling back, the bravest thing you can do is stand up and walk forward. Jordan Hale understood that truth before she ever wore a uniform. She lives it every day she serves. And somewhere, in a small house on the outskirts of El Paso, a retired Marine Raider smiles every time he hears her name mentioned with the reverence it deserves.